Short Stories, Hastings State Hospital is a series of oral histories taken from people who worked at the Hastings State Hospital through the years between its opening in 1900 to its closing in 1978. The project has been financed by a fund, a grant coming from the Legacy Fund distributed by the Minnesota Historical Society. It is also a project between the Dakota County Historical Society and the Hastings Community Television. Through this series, we are going to attempt to show the history of the Hastings State Asylum, as it was called at that time, and how many changes took place and the community that it served. We are interviewing many employees who have had a variety of jobs there through the years, and our first interviewee is Lew Linde, who I would like to introduce to you. Good morning, Lew.
Good morning, Heidi.
And could you tell us a little bit, Lew, about your background and how you began to be associated with the Hastings State Hospital?
Well, it was interesting. I got to Hastings. I got a master's degree in social work at Indiana University in 1957 on a state scholarship. It was a beautiful scholarship, paid everything. And one of the conditions of that scholarship is that I had to spend 2 years working in a state hospital when I graduated. So I graduated in the summer of 1957. And I could have, there were 6 state hospitals at that time. I picked Hastings because I wanted to be close to St. Paul and the metropolitan area.
Okay. And when you came to Hastings and started at the hospital, what were some of your responsibilities? What was your job title?
Well, psychiatric social worker.
Okay.
Hastings at that time, when I got there in '57, had 1,000 patients.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 4 social workers. And I was assigned the responsibility of being the social worker for the geriatric unit. Now, surprisingly, at that time there was about 365 geriatric patients, people with dementia and Alzheimer's. And that was basically my job. And what I did is that when a person was committed as mentally ill, then I interviewed the family. Mm-hmm. And got what they call a social history, and then I reported the social history back to, we had a team. At that time, every patient had a team of a doctor, social worker, rehab person, a nurse, and a social worker. And then what they do is staff the case and come up with a plan for that patient. And of course, I hate to say this, but as it is today, with Alzheimer's patients, there isn't much hope. Mm-hmm. So in those days, they just stayed there till they died. We placed a few of them out, but mainly that was the end of their life.
Sure. And what types of, you said that there were this team that was working with them, and there were rehab, and so were there programs that were designed for this individual? Or?
Well, for the people we dealt with, it was just basically care, like a nursing home care. Mm-hmm. Now, we did have I also had worked with on a team. We had 100 regular psychiatric patients, and the person I worked with was Dr. Joseph Delorty, who was a wonderful man. I might add about Dr. Delorty, he was the only doctor in the hospital that hadn't gone through treatment for chemical dependency.
Oh, okay.
There's a story behind that where in those days, before that, doctors that would go through chemical dependency treatment would have a tough time finding a job. Well, I was trying to think of the name of the doctor that was in charge of Hastings at the time. That was one of his things that he did, is give these people a break. And fine, they did a great job.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting aside from almost a treatment plan for them too, in a way. What was, when you talked about this, the Dr. Delorty that you worked for?
Dr. Delorty, yeah.
What was your relationship with him? What types of things
would
you do?
I was assigned to him as a social worker. I used to make rounds with him in the geriatric unit, and of course in those days you know, had white coats on, a tie, and the whole. You're pretty, you know, and of course the doctor. And we'd make rounds through the wards, and he always wanted me to walk with him. And he'd ask patients about who's the President of the United States, and where are we, and all that sort of thing. And of course, you always got an answer that was muddled up.
Oh, okay. And what was the ward like? How were people cared for?
Well, the thing is that, you know, the interesting thing about Dr. Lorde, all the wards were locked, and of course, when he opened up, he always lit a cigarette. And I always wondered about that, because what he really was doing, I mean, the nursing staff did a great job of taking care of the patients. Of course, a lot of them were incontinent, so that cigarette smoke kind of dulled. But I can honestly say that the patients received excellent care. I didn't ever see any abuse, and of course, they had, if they had any medical problems, they were taken care of, or dental problems. It was a wonderful, actually, they got very good care.
You mentioned that one of your functions of your job was to deal with the families.
Yes.
Was there a lot of connection between the patients and their families?
What happened, once the patient was admitted, then I would meet with the next of kin, the person that probably signed the commitment papers. And it was an interesting phenomenon, because the interview usually lasted a half hour. In the first half hour, you'd have to deal with the guilt. People had a lot of guilt about committing mother or dad or something like that. Then after you got over that kind of release of all that guilt, then you get into the social history of where they went to school, where they worked, their relationship to the community and the family. The one interesting thing about the patients, and this is not scientific at all, but one of the things I found out about geriatric patients, that they had lived their life in pretty much isolation.
Oh.
You know, they didn't have much contact, and I don't know if that's one of the causes for Alzheimer's disease, but that was one of the characteristics. They were loners, pretty much.
So you've referred a couple times now to Alzheimer's, and in your estimation, were a lot of these patients Alzheimer's, but that we would today call that, but at that time?
I think so. You know, the interesting thing is that they use the technical term with senile dementia. And the doctor I worked with, and I think it's still true today, that they really can't tell if a person has Alzheimer's until they do an autopsy on their brain.
Okay.
So, I mean, I use those two terms probably interrelatedly.
Okay.
Senile dementia and Alzheimer's.
Were any of these people violent or really disturbed so that they would have to be?
I don't think so. Not the age. There was nothing violent about them at all. They just had to be, man, it's like having dealing with a child that's, you know.
One of the things that struck me, because I've been doing a lot of reading about the grounds at the hospital, and through the years how therapeutic they would do things, getting people out to be outside and have picnics and did they do any of those types of things?
No, they were confined to a ward.
Really?
But as far as the other patients, they were, you know, they could walk around and participate in the movies. And of course, it's the Hastings State Hospital, for those that don't know, the beautiful grounds there. The Alzheimer's, I suppose they took them out occasionally, but it wasn't like a person that was a mentally ill patient that could, you know, go to the canteen and walk around, that sort of thing.
So they didn't take them outside for fresh air and things? I'm surprised.
Well, they might have done. I really can't say they did or they didn't, but I would say most of their time was spent indoors.
Okay. Well, I believe that you had told me previously that you yourself lived on the grounds.
Yes, they had an employee's quarters, and
okay. Could you
it was
tell
a real
us?
bargain. For $31 a month, you got board and room and laundry.
Wow.
And then the room that I lived in, that was clean, you know, so it was just, it was really quite a bargain.
And what did you do? I mean, were you able to have free reign of the grounds and recreate and do things
well, I didn't
that
really,
you wanted to?
all of my social activities, of course, were off the ground, although I will say it's kind of interesting thing, the question of where do you meet your spouse, where do you meet your wife? Well, I met her at the state hospital. That's always kind of a family joke we had.
You met each other at the state hospital.
After we started to go there, I spent time with her. She was a nursing instructor on the grounds.
Oh, okay. Tell us a little bit about that. Well, first of all, The name of your future bride was?
Marcella Ruhr, and her maiden name was Schultzenzon. She was a four-year graduate of nursing school at St. Catherine University, and she'd worked in different places, and then she was widowed in 1955, and I came there in 1957, and but she was an excellent instructor. She was instructed the psychiatric aides, and then she also taught, for example, if a psychiatric aide was having problems on the ward, she would, intervene and talk to that person. So I was kind of for it all.
Well, when did she start working there then, Lou?
She started working in about 1956.
Okay.
And then we met
shortly before you.
Then I went in 57, and then we got married in 1959.
Okay. Let's go back to that again about Marcella working with some of the aides who might have a problem, and she would help them intervene. That was her position entirely, was working with the aides, teaching new ones.
It was all, she was training in it all. When an aide, as a matter of fact, in those days, the aides did not really have any prior training, so to speak. I'm talking generally. And so when they started to work at the hospital, then it was introducing the aide to, mental illness, the symptoms, what to expect. I was just mentioning earlier before we went on that nowadays you hear about mental patients that the police and sheriffs have trouble with mental patients. But one thing about the state hospital, they knew how to, I'm going to use the word disarm, but if you had someone that was kind of acting out and violent, they taught these aides how to deal with them and not get involved in a lot of violence and that sort of thing.
I know that at one time they were using shock therapy and different types of treatment like that to help settle people down if they, yes.
It was a treatment for depression. And it's, in those days, that's over 50 years ago, it isn't a very pleasant experience to watch someone have electroshock treatment because they give them a dose of electricity and then they go into convulsions, and it's really quite a sight. They eliminated that, although I can tell you nowadays, I happen to have a son that's a psychiatrist in San Francisco, and they use it to, in other words, electroshock, I'm kind of getting off the track now, but what the thing is that electroshock treatments are now used as a last resort. In other words, they've tried everything, and in some cases it works. But yeah, they had electroshock, and then we had a few patients there too that had the prefrontal lobotomy, where they do surgery on the on their forehead, and they used to do all of that at the Rochester State Hospital. They, I think, eliminated that before that, and of course, you go back in history, in 1946 with Governor Youngdahl was here, they used to put people in restraints, and that sort of thing. That was eliminated, I think, in 1947. Of course, they did use medications to kind of calm people. Thorazine was the big thing.
Were any of the people in the geriatric ward that you were connected with, was that a treatment that would have been used, the electric shock therapy for depression with that population?
I really, it's hard for me to answer it. Maybe in their earlier days, they might have had electroshock before they wound up, but as far as treating geriatric patients at that time, there was no electroshock, and there was no medication. It was just plain care.
Just care.
Yeah.
What would your typical day be like then, if you were?
Well,
I mean,
there was four of us, 4 social workers plus a supervisor. Everyone had their master's degree. The supervisor was kind of interesting. He'd always start off the day with a joke, so kind of put us in a good mood. A lot of it was seeing patients, or not patients, relatives. That was, and then we had, of course, when they admitted a person, they always had a staff meeting. So I attended a lot of meetings where you had what we called staff a patient. There was a doctor, social worker, and that sort of thing. It was an interesting thing too in those days. For the other 100, not the geriatric, but the other 100 patients, that was the first days of what they call TSM. Now, the psychiatrics use it as a Bible. Now there's 4 volumes.
what is TSM?
It's a manual to help diagnose a mental illness.
Okay.
And and in those days, it was just probably 75 pages.
Mm-hmm.
But what they did is then you discuss the person's symptoms. You know, he or she did this or did that and that sort of thing. Then the psychologist would open up this manual, and they'd come out schizophrenic. They used to use a term for depression, involutional melancholia. That's depression, all those terms. But that's what they came up with, a diagnosis, and then they'd prescribe treatment. And of course, the goal with the regular patients, well, even with the geriatrics to a certain extent, the goal was to treat them and then get them ready for discharge, return to the community. And of course, I was involved in that, you know, making placement plans for people in the community. And the interesting thing about those days is you'd have a patient that you really have your fingers crossed, you wonder, oh, he or she is not going to make it. They'd go out and sail along and make it. You get a patient that was what we call a model patient, you thought, oh, it's not going to be any problem. They're the ones that had problems. But it's a mental illness is a terrible disease, and we have to recognize that. And I really sometimes I think that with all the state hospitals in Minnesota, I'm kind of getting into the philosophical political end, but I think that, you know, now, I read the story in the Star Tribune this morning about St. Peter. That's about the only mental hospital we have. Well, Anoka too, but they used to help a lot of people, and that sort of thing. Now, the statistics show a lot of your homeless people are mentally ill. Well, years ago, they'd be in a state hospital.
Right, and I think that's an interesting. You bring up an interesting perspective of this whole topic, that the first 100 people, all men, that were brought to the hospital when it opened in 1900 were just brought here to be taken care of. There was no plan for treatment or any hope for them to ever leave.
Incurables,
and many of them didn't. They were incurables. So through the years that changed, so that up to 1957, when you became involved, you were already looking at placing people in the community. And with some successes, a lot of people I've heard say that's why the Hastings State Hospital eventually closed. Was because...
Well, that's of course, that's another philosophical question too, that when they closed, then they put these people mentally ill out in the community and said that the community should take care of them. Well, what's happened, that whole thing has failed. I mean, has been kind of a failure. I think the other thing too about those days is that the county welfare departments, now they call them human service departments, they had the responsibility of supervising and providing care for these people. That's kind of, this is my own personal opinion, but that's all kind of fallen by the wayside now. They're just mentally ill, they just kind of wander around. And of course, they changed the law in Minnesota too, that to be committed as mentally ill, either the person has to be dangerous to other people or dangerous to himself, and that's kind of the criteria. Well, the thing is, that may not be possible, but still a person is mentally ill and needs treatment if they're not dangerous.
Right. Well, let's just back up a little bit and go back to, you mentioned about families bringing their parent in or their elder family member into the program and committing them. How would that process work? How would
the Hastings was a receiving hospital for Dakota County and Ramsey County. Most of our patients came from Ramsey County. And of course, they'd have to go through a commitment process. They'd have to, sign a petition that the person is mentally ill, and then they would have a hearing. And then the hearing is presided by a judge, and then they'd take testimony from psychiatrists or doctors, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And then if the decision is made that the person was mentally ill and needed treatment, they went out.
That was what I was getting at, because I was curious if families could just do that on their own, or if there was a doctor or a medical, person involved in that process, and there was.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Of course. Yeah. And of course, the other thing is that I think sometimes they found that they also had private treatment programs. And then there was a question of could a person go in a private program or could they be treated in the community? Nowadays, that's the mode where the people are treated in the community. Very few are committed nowadays.
Interesting that they were already looking at that back then.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. I'd like to go back, if you could just tell us a little bit, you said you moved to Hastings to take this job at the state hospital. What type of, when you came to Hastings, did you get a sense of how the citizens viewed the state hospital, whether they thought it was, did they look at it as a scary place or what type of a reputation?
Hastings at that time had a population of about 5,000. And of course, patients were never allowed to go into the community. The thing about a state hospital is you're safer there from crime and all that than you are in the community. I felt that, excuse me, there was kind of a general fear, I suppose, of mentally ill. I mean, no one likes to, if you see someone mentally ill or acting strangely, you kind of think, well, I don't particularly like that. But I felt that Hastings itself was welcoming and friendly, that sort of thing, towards the mentally ill. And of course, the other thing is that Hastings was a resident of a lot of our employees.
Yes.
So your psychiatric aides and all the other professional people, they lived in Hastings, and so there was always that kind of warm-hearted acceptance of the patients, and people made their living out there.
I've heard a lot of, heard a few stories where people said that they felt like it was one big family. It was,
well,
people
I
were,
wouldn't, I don't know
you
if I'd
didn't have
go as
that
far to say
experience.
that it was one big family. I think there was one, as far as the employees, it was one big family. And of course, they used to have employees' parties, a Christmas party, and picnics and all that sort of thing. So yes, there was there wasn't elitism. In other words, I guess you get the idea of the one big family. Everybody kind of thought, well, we're all in the same situation and that sort of thing.
You said you were there, what, like 2.5 years that you were employed? After you left the hospital, what did you do for a career?
Well, I've had a variety of things. Then I went to the Department of Public Welfare. I was in mental retardation unit. The other thing is I got my law degree in 1960, and then I practiced law for, well, up until a year ago. And I had a variety of jobs. I was on the parole board here in Minnesota for 11 years, and then the last 20 years, I retired 20 years ago, and then I've been doing pro bono work, helping people get out of bad marriages. So it's been kind of although I can say that my training as a psychiatric social worker has helped me in the practice of law. You seem to have, well, I think there's a more keen awareness to people's problems, what they're going through, and some people some lawyers don't even handle a divorce because it's kind of a big mess. Well, the thing about handling a divorce is that it's kind of in the same league. You know, you're dealing with people that have problems and trying to help them, improve themselves
at a vulnerable time in their lives.
Yeah.
What do you remember any special people that you worked with while you were at the state hospital, or any patients that stand out in your memory?
Well, yes. I probably, I don't know if we have time to tell a little story.
Yes, we have.
One day, Dr. Delory and I were going through the wards, making rounds, and there was I'm just going to use her first name, there's a woman by the name of Rose. And this Rose, of course, was very mentally ill. She just sat there and stared into space. So he used to ask questions. So he walked up to Rose and he said, "Rose, am I the doctor?" Just completely silent, nothing said. Then he said, "Am I the nurse?" No response. Then I think he asked her, "Am I the janitor?" No response. So we stood there for about, I don't know, 20, 30 seconds. He said, "Oh, you're the man that collects the income tax."
Just out of the blue.
So, and what, that was a, so, you know, there's a lot of humor too. I'll never forget, I don't know if you can use this word on but you believe it, but when I first got there, for the first 10 days, they took us through orientation. You know, all the different, there was nurses and we had all the different things, and of course it was in the summertime. And it's an open hospital, the patients are walking around. So, but we were in a group, and I suppose that this one patient, particularly a middle-aged man, he was walking around looking at us, and then he looked at us for a while, and then he turned and he says, "I'm not going to take any shit from anybody." So it's kind of, you get, that's kind of the lighter side. And you know, it isn't all, and of course, so it's, you met a lot of interest. Of course, if people are suffering too, that's a thing too. You can't get, what's the word I want to say, callous about it either.
Right.
You have to be sensitive to these people. Sort of thing.
Were there any special events that occurred those 2 years, 2.5 years that you were there that you think about that stand out, a big change or anything that?
Well, I don't know if there's the director. We had Dr. Sheely as a medical director. He's a psychiatrist, and we used to have staff meetings every 2 weeks where he'd bring in a patient, interview the patient, and it was kind of a learning session. He was an interesting man too. This is kind of a little side story. He graduated from medical school right at the start of World War II, and they assigned him to the job of making psychological tests for pilots. You know, who could, what kind of a test should you give to a person that's flying? And he said after they went through all the tests and work, they found out that the best way to find out if a person can fly a plane is put them in a plane and let them fly. But he was a very interesting. So, you know, those some of the things that happened.
Right.
And I remember too another patient that Dr. Lordy had. I was her social worker. You know, it was interesting. A sad part. This woman was probably about 20 or 21 years old. She was very beautiful. And if they put her in one of these shows where you had a makeover or something like that, she'd really come on. But the sad part is she had a terrible childhood and she was mentally ill. You know, that's the other thing. Same with men too. That you see that were bright, good looking, all that sort of thing. Mentally ill. So it's a tough disease. It's still with us today. That's the problem.
Yes, it is. And so, well, I really appreciate you coming in and talking about your time at the hospital. Do you have any more stories to tell about you and Marcella? You got married. You met at the state hospital.
Met at the state hospital. I remember her. We were at a staff meeting. You know, they always sort of, where did you see your spouse for the first time? It was at a staff meeting, and there she was in a white starch uniform, and a white starch cap. And she's beautiful.
Yes,
so
she was.
I was pretty impressed by what happened.
Yeah. Great.
Not everybody's lucky like that.
That's right. That's right. And I know that you and Marcella had a wonderful many years together, and I had the opportunity to interview both of you together a few years back, and that was enjoyable too. So.
She's been deceased for 13 years now.
Yes. Great loss for you and your family, I know. Well, thanks again
You're welcome.
for you to come in today, Lou. We really appreciate it.
I thank you for interviewing, but I also want to mention too that it's a great thing that you're doing a documentary on the state hospital, because if you wait another 10, 15 years, all this information is going to be lost.
You know, Lou, I'm happy you said that, because you are the person that started all this.
Well,
if you hadn't suggested this to me a year ago, we probably wouldn't be here today.
Here we are.
So thank you for taking that, you know, thinking about that, that there were a lot of important stories surrounding the Hastings State Hospital, and many of these people won't be with us. So this is where the time is now to do this.
Part of history that's important, because see, that's all changed. Now we've got that committing people, and they think state hospitals shouldn't be here, and
times have changed.
I think they did a lot of good work.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay.